One of the most common requests that we get is somebody will reach out and say, I need to do my annual penetration test. Now, what this autonomous testing tool does is it goes in and acts like an attacker would. So it's looking for vulnerabilities, then looks for default credentials, it has password spraying, it can look for exposed credentials on the dark web. But the real beauty of it is it's fed all these different attack vectors and it can chain things together. So if it finds an exposed credential over here and a weak password over there and a vulnerability somewhere else, it can try and pull all that together to get to something that it shouldn't be able to. And the real beauty of that tool is that it can run on an ongoing basis. So for most clients, you could run it every week, you could run it every day, you could run it monthly. Most clients, if they're a larger environment, would run that monthly.
Welcome to Podcast Wise, Perspectives, Cybersecurity, and AI. In an era where digital transformation is no longer optional, many organizations are investing millions in security tools, yet remaining fundamentally exposed. The question isn't just do we have the tools, but are they actually working tonight? Joining us to bridge the gap between technical defense and business resilience is Tracy Fox. Tracy is a seasoned technology consultant at Foresight Cybersecurity, with a career trajectory that spans the early days of Apple and education to a decade on the front lines of cyber risk mitigation. Tracy specializes in translating complex technical vulnerabilities into strategic business conversations. Today we're diving into the power of managed autonomous testing, the legal realities of safe harbor laws, and why your cyber insurance policy might not be the safety net you think it is. All right, let's get started. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Hey, Tracy.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for asking. So, all right, let's do a little icebreaker here. So, Tracy, tell me, considering your focus on proactive risk management, what's one non-obvious daily habit or tool you use to stay ahead of the curve personally or professionally?
Well, I would say professionally, one of the top things that we've used to stay ahead of risk is managed autonomous testing. So it's a very cool tool. It's actually by Horizon 3 AI. We wrapped a managed service around it, but it helps identify exploitable vulnerabilities, and you'd be amazed at what it can find. So we eat our own dog food. We run it on ourselves. We highly recommend it to clients, but that's helped us detect things that before an attacker could, and that's what all you can do at this point, right? Try and
Yeah.
stay ahead of the attackers.
Yeah. So you've built a career in technology consulting. How has your initial work informed your current perspective on strategic value of cybersecurity, shifting it from a cost center to a core business enabler for C-suite leaders?
Yeah, when I first started in technology consulting, it was a long time ago. And honestly, it was by accident. It's not my background was not in technology, it was in business. And so I kind of fell into it because I started working in the office of a micro age back in the day in the 80s. And so when I first started in consulting, it was really more about break fix and what kind of technologies could help businesses do what they needed to do day to day. About 10 years ago, we really were focused strictly on cybersecurity and compliance requirements. And so now the challenge is helping businesses to understand that security and compliance are not IT issues. They truly are business issues. That's where the impact is. And so I think it's been helpful that I come from a different background than a lot of our technical resources, because when we're on those calls together and I can see a CFO, a COO, a executive director, maybe not fully grasping the technical aspects of what we're discussing, bring it back around to that business risk conversation and what would it mean to you if, and what does it look like if all of a sudden you couldn't transact for a week? Those kinds of questions. I think that's something that's often missing in technology conversations, and it's really critical to include it so that all of the stakeholders can understand and get behind whatever the initiative is for security.
Yeah, I totally agree, because a lot of people, especially the non-technical people, they're like, why do I need this? Right? Why do I need
Right.
cybersecurity? Why is it so essential? Why is that a buzzword? Is that something that is really relevant to us? to the business. So I would say that, having your skill set, from the business aspects of things is always helpful because the CFO, the COO are sometimes not as technical as we would like them to be, because they're good at what they're doing,
Right.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I get it. They're sometimes frustrated because they'll say, I spend X number of dollars every year on all these security solutions. So why do I still need something else? So they
Mhm.
just really need that understanding of, is this replacing something? Is it a consolidation? Is it an enhancement? How are we making sure that they're seeing the value of what they're investing in?
Yeah.
That's what they want to know. And I find if you can really articulate that well for them, then you don't have a fight on your hands. And it's very helpful to their internal IT staff because sometimes they can't always articulate that to them.
Mhm.
They're almost
Yeah.
afraid to go and say, we need this, because they know it's one more thing. And they might have used up some of that collateral asking for other things. So it can help them have us in the conversation too.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, in your work with diverse set of clients, what is the single biggest area of systemic risk you are currently seeing? So, not just an attack vector, but a failure of organizational or executive foresight. And how is that risk profile changing year over year?
So, what I have seen is just such a heavy reliance on tools without validation of how well they're working. So, I'll give you an example is if you implemented a security monitoring solution years ago, right? It may have been working very well when it was implemented, but if it's not constantly being tuned and someone looking at what are the new log sources, right? New technologies are brought into organizations all the time, and sometimes they don't realize that this tool will not know about these new solutions unless someone adds those log feeds in. So that's just one type of example, but I think there's such a reliance on, we bought it, we installed it, and there's an assumption that it's optimally installed to be secure.
Mm.
And so I think that's a big risk vector because some of these solutions sit and essentially become useless, or they get installed by a manufacturer's representative who, again, they may hook it all up, but are they going through it and tuning it for your environment and making sure all the security settings are set? Even things like cloud services, people assume if they buy into Microsoft or Azure that when they are set up, that everything that could be turned on for security would automatically be turned on, and that's just not the case.
Yeah.
So I think it's often the simple things like that. It's not always a huge risk that people aren't aware of. It's a lot of assumption that causes, to me, some of the biggest unnecessary risk that you can easily address.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's always like let's say you get Microsoft 365, and some of the settings on there you're not they're on, but they're not supposed to be on based on experience on somebody got attacked from that particular setting being on, and then it's not like they went back and reset the whole setting to disable that setting, right? Microsoft did not do that, so they're relying on the users or the technical people to know that they need to disable that setting so that it does not become a risk, right? So like sometimes like it's like you have to know as a technical person to disable something or to enable something to make sure that everything is secure, because you buy a software and you innately think that it's already secure, but you have
Right.
to go in and make sure that it is secure, that all of the STIGs, all of the settings are properly set, and then go from there, and then re-image, have your gold standard image for it. And I think that's also like a wheel that is continuously going down the line, that there's
It
the
needs to be. Right.
right.
And that's another issue that we see in security and compliance as well, is if you assess your security or go through a compliance assessment once, then you're not done.
Hmm.
Even if you pass with flying colors, it's still an ongoing initiative that you have to be constantly looking at because your environment's going to change, threats are going to change, new vulnerabilities are always coming out, new attack vectors. So you really have to be looking at these things pretty regularly. And like I said, validating through various types of testing to make sure that what your assumptions are accurate.
Yeah.
So with cloud service, it's more often enabling settings than disabling, but take something like a firewall. We've also seen firewalls when we're brought into a company and we start looking at the settings of the firewalls. You can have the best firewall in the world, but if a whole bunch of ports have been opened up by various vendors or staff to make something work, and then they don't always remember to go back in and turn it off, maybe you haven't even worked with that vendor for years, you have all these holes in your firewall, you're not protected like you think you are. But
Hmm.
unless someone's looking at that, how would you know? It's
Right.
there, the lights are blinking. So again, the assumption is it's doing everything it should do.
Yeah. And also, like, question, what would you recommend? How many times per year should you do like an assessment?
So there's different things to look at, different ways of looking at them. And one of the newer solutions that's really gaining traction is autonomous testing. And so people are aware of penetration testing, right? It's one of the most common requests that we get is somebody will reach out and say, I need to do my annual penetration test. Now, what this autonomous testing tool does is it goes in and acts like an attacker would. So it's looking for vulnerabilities that it could exploit. It looks for default credentials. It has password spraying. It can look for exposed credentials on the dark web. But the real beauty of it is it's fed all these different attack vectors and it can chain things together. So if it finds an exposed credential over here and a weak password over there and a vulnerability somewhere else, it can try and pull all that together to get to something that it shouldn't be able to. And the real beauty of that tool is that it can run on an ongoing basis. So for most clients, you could run it every week, you could run it every day, you could run it monthly. Most clients, if they're a larger environment, would run that monthly because you're going to get some findings, you need some time to go in, and it gives you all the steps to remediate what it found. And then you can retest with one click. So
Cool.
that process, kind of like if you do a vulnerability scan, if you did it every day, it might find something different on day 14 than it found on day 1. But meanwhile, you're trying to clean up what you found on day 1 and day 2 and day 3. So we tune that so that it's the right cadence per client and based on their environment size and how many vulnerabilities they have initially, but ideally at least once a month. And that does a couple of things because it's going to tell you if you have exploitable weaknesses that you can fix before an attacker gets to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But another thing that it does test is it'll also show if it does successfully get to something it shouldn't. How is your security monitoring working? Did it detect this? Because it's doing the same thing an attacker would do. So it's kind of a de facto test of your security monitoring. Do you have the right logs being collected? Do you have the right business rules? Do you have people looking at it 24/7 to notice if something is detected? Maybe your solution runs in-house and no one's really paying attention. So all of those things can be checked in that way. Compliance is a little bit different because it doesn't shift as often. So I would say if you do an assessment against, say, the NIST cybersecurity framework, or if you fall under HIPAA or PCI, if you do a recheck every year, that's usually enough to say what's changed in the compliance requirements, what's changed in your environment. Internally, I think you should have that discussion at least once a quarter. Or if you have any kind of major change to your network, then at least double check that aspect against your compliance requirements.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense because at least at every big changes, right? At least.
Right. And,
And what's
we've seen people get hit with heavy penalties that they thought that they were compliant because they had had a successful assessment at one point in time, but not realizing that when there's a major change, now they may no longer be compliant. And then if data gets exposed, obviously, it's not just regulatory fines, but also There can be class action lawsuits. It can be extremely expensive to believe that you're compliant and then find out you're not.
Yeah, that would suck. Now, the concept of cybersecurity safe harbor is intriguing, right? For a
Hmm.
business, does it truly offer a measurable layer of protection, or does it risk breeding a sense of complacency that ultimately increase their overall exposure?
I think it's very helpful because most of our compliance is the stick. If you don't do this, then you're going to get hit with the stick.
Mm-hmm.
Where Safe Harbor, what I liked about it was a nice proactive way of saying, if you do take this seriously and take the steps to make sure that you're meeting your data protection requirements, then you can have some protection, because the reality is there's nothing anybody can do, our company, any other company, any one solution. If you said, I have an unlimited budget for security and I just want to make sure that I never have data exposed, I never have any kind of incident, there's nobody that can guarantee that.
Right.
So, I think without Safe Harbor, you get a little bit of, well, it doesn't almost matter what I do because people can still get in somehow, some way. So I'm just going to save my money up for when that inevitably happens and then deal with it.
Yeah.
With Safe Harbor, right, you could say, if you proactively take these steps, then in the event that despite that, you did have an incident, but you can show that you did take it seriously and you did align to a recognized framework, well, now you've got some protection against regulatory fines and even class action lawsuits in some states. So I really think it's a big positive. I don't think it got as much press as it should have. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of times when we talk to businesses that are in the states that have Safe Harbor, they aren't aware of it at all. But I think it's a really important step towards incenting security.
Yeah.
Let's make sure, the people are incented to at least try, even though nothing's 100%.
Yeah, I agree with that. So when you advise clients on true story of cyber risk, what is the most effective metric or narrative to use when communicating the necessity of security investment to a non-technical board of directors?
Yeah. Well, one of the big questions that I'll ask them is if they have commercial insurance that has cyber coverage. So in the event they had a major incident, do they have that kind of insurance coverage as a backstop? Most times they're going to say yes. Well, then if you ask them if they've ever actually read the policy, most times the answer is no, because they talked to their broker, they were given a questionnaire, their IT person or their IT consulting firm, whatever they use for support, usually fills that out. They send it in, they get their coverage, right? So they think they've got 5 million, 10 million, whatever the number is, to back them up if they have an incident. But if they actually read the policy, they're going to see wording in there around meeting data protection requirements or reasonable data protection. So I'll point that out. Now, they don't usually have their policy right then and there, but
Right.
you'll see them jotting notes that they're going to go and look at it. And then I'll say, so what if you had a major incident? Now you've got a couple $1 million claim, and then the insurance company finds out that you weren't doing everything you should have been doing. You had holes in your security. You weren't meeting, if you had PCI or HIPAA or data privacy requirements or reasonable security. How do you prove that? The best way is to proactively align to a recognized cyber framework, like the NIST cybersecurity framework or
Mhm.
ISO or SOC 2. You can pick a framework, CIS top controls. If you proactively do that, then it becomes almost impossible for anyone, including a regulator, a lawyer who's trying to bring a class action suit, or a commercial insurance company who doesn't want to pay your $2 million claim.
Mhm.
It becomes a lot harder for them to say you didn't do what was reasonable. On the other hand, if they don't really pay attention to security and they just put things in place ad hoc and assume that what they're doing is enough, they could find themselves in a position where they cannot collect and then face those potential fines and class action suits. So that one question tends to get their attention and perk their ears up and get them a little bit more engaged in, okay, what do we need to do to make sure we're not in that position?
Mhm. Yeah, because you don't want to be in that position. So that's a
No.
really position.
And unfortunately, we get clients when they're in some level of that position. We'll get a phone call. We work a lot with managed service providers who are doing IT services and value-added resellers who sell hardware and software. They'll get a call from a client who's in the midst of an incident, and then they'll bring them to us. Now, we can still help them to a degree, but there's only so much we can do after the fact, right?
Yeah.
We can't save you from that situation. If you're already in that situation, we can only help you going forward. So the best time to have these conversations is proactively before you're in that position, because, the pocketbook's going to open up then because you're not going to have a choice.
Yeah, it's just like seeing one of those memes where they're like, oh, after an incident that happens, CISOs or the CFO is signing checks, you know, because you're like, okay, well now let's take it seriously because we did get into incidents versus, well, we never got into an incident, so let's open the checkbook now so that we never get into that position. Yeah,
Right.
that's interesting to see people's mindset when something big happens.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's not that unlike our health, because sometimes you don't really feel like doing the things or want to spend the money on the vitamins or the exercise, all the things that we know we really should do. But
Hmm.
when you get that scary diagnosis and they're telling you you're at risk of a heart attack if you don't do XYZ, or you need a procedure, or you're going to have a serious issue, right? All of a
Hmm.
sudden, you're not thinking about, I don't really feel like doing it. I don't really want to spend that money. You're doing whatever you have to do. It's kind of like that, but you don't want it to get to that point.
No, we don't. So, if you could advise every executive to ask themselves just 3 key strategic questions about their current cybersecurity posture, what would those non negotiable questions be?
Yeah. So that first one is definitely, have you ever read your commercial cyber insurance policy?
Hmm.
Because most of them have not. They just assume if they got the insurance, they're covered. So they want to make sure they know about that reasonable or meeting data protection requirements, but also they should really take a close look at what their actual coverage is, because you might have a number that looks big, like $5 million, and you think that's great and covered. But the sub language might say if there was business email compromise, that's limited at $10,000. Or if you get ransomware, that's limited at $25,000. So sometimes the most common attack vectors are going to be very limited, making sure they understand where they're covered, where they're not, and that they can actually collect on a claim. So that's definitely always a question I ask. Another one is, could unpatched vulnerabilities or misconfigurations or default or exposed credentials be exploited to gain access to their data? And they'll kind of look at me and say, I don't think so, or I don't know. You need to know, because really those are the ways most attackers are getting in. And it might start with something like a phishing attempt and getting somebody's credentials. But if they get those credentials, what could they do with them?
Hmm.
So that ongoing testing can help find those things. And it also has a feature where a lot of companies are getting pretty good about doing online security awareness training, and they'll do email phishing campaigns. Well, if a staff member does give up their credentials, let's say I fall for the campaign, you can go into this tool and put in the credentials that I provided and come back and show me, based on that, here's what an attacker could have gotten to.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. And it also helps from the business perspective of, did Tracy Fox really need access to all those things? Maybe, we need to look at who we're giving access to in a blanket way versus on a need to know basis. So that's another one is, could those things be exploited to gain access to their data? And then the last one is, how do you know your security monitoring is truly effective? And I've got horror stories about that going back years, everywhere from, a large restaurant chain who was paying a managed security service provider, MSSP, to do their security monitoring. And the CFO happened to go into the server room one day, and he was going into a file cabinet or something for the backups, switching tapes. We're going a little
Wow.
ways back. But he accidentally unhitched the firewall from the monitoring solution. They had a little box in there that was supposed to be monitoring everything, and he realized he pulled the plug And he was thinking, geez, they're going to call me because this went offline. And then he thought, I wonder how long it'll take them to call me. So he didn't plug it back in. He figured, I'm going to wait and see how long it takes them to call me. And 2 weeks later, when he had not gotten any notification of anything, not reporting, being offline, having any kind of issue, he called us and said,
Wow.
yeah, I don't think this is doing what I thought it was doing. And that's just a really simplistic example. But I recently was working with a CIO at a university, and he had been promoted not that long before, and his predecessor had put in Splunk, which is a great solution. There's nothing wrong with Splunk. But the problem is when you're running something like that internally, you need people who are trained to keep it updated.
Mm-hmm.
And so he doesn't have experience in it. No one else on the team had experience in it. And so it was just kind of there, and they weren't sure what it was doing, and it was giving them a lot of alerts, but most of the time they were false positives, or they didn't have some of the new logs in there and they weren't really sure. They could point logs to it, but they didn't know how to adapt their business rules within the software to say, if you see these things, alert us on these logs. So it had really just become something that was there checking a box, but not really being effective. And that's when, again, they reached out to us and said, we think we need help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had that experience with a software like that where it was just there for to check a box. I mean, I was only able to install it, run a query on it, and then let it sit, you know. It was really just there to check a box in the SSP. And we're like, okay, well, we do have one of those. And yeah, that because nobody on the team knew what to do with it.
Right.
We didn't have the knowledge to be like, okay, well, let's go look for something else that is more adaptable to the team, and somebody has the knowledge to how to use it. It was really there just to check a box, which is unfortunate. Like I think that we could have done more with it, but nobody had that knowledge, especially when it's something like as complex as Splunk,
Mhm.
right? So I don't know what it is now, but when I was using it, it was a little bit complicated.
And any tool, it doesn't matter how good the tool is. If you don't know how to use it, or even if somebody implements it perfectly initially, but then it just kind of stays that way, nobody's really caring for it and updating it and tuning it, then it's not going to be as effective as it could. And, when you think about security information event monitoring or SIM solutions, there's a term now, legacy SIM. They haven't been around all that long in the mainstream. Enterprise had them first. But now even most small businesses have something. It's usually through an MSSP. But what is it actually doing? If you think about how you want it to be effective, a good analogy is if it's only monitoring the endpoints, and we get these phone calls after there's an incident. So I'll use business email compromise. Somebody gets into an email, it's usually an executive where they expose credentials somehow. They get into their email, they start emailing all these clients or, whoever's in their email address book, and then they want a forensics investigation. Well, the attackers often will wipe out the logs, or they could modify the logs. There's a lot of things they can do if they're in there undetected. And when someone comes to us and they're looking for help with getting a forensics investigation or what do they do next, if the monitoring that they have has only been on their endpoints, and sometimes even those logs aren't being collected, it's just there's something sitting in their environment and it's letting logs flow through it, but it's not making a copy of those logs and putting them somewhere else where an attacker doesn't have access to them, then it makes it really hard to truly conduct a forensics investigation. But the other problem with that is if you can't prove, if someone got access to the network and you can't prove that the data wasn't accessed or stolen, then in many cases it's going to be ruled that you have to assume it has been.
Mm-hmm.
So it just opens them up to a lot of issues where, we'll hear, well, why didn't my MSSP detect this? Well, again, if it was something outside of what you have them monitoring, if it was in your cloud environment or something through the firewall and they are only seeing your endpoints, then they couldn't see it. There was no way they were going to detect it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really important to make sure that you have all of the critical sources. Again, taking back to an analogy, if you're protecting a business physical location and you put in an alarm system and you have the alerts if a door is opened, if a window is opened, any point of access, you have motion detectors, but then you only have ADT monitor the front door. Well, if somebody comes in through the window, they won't know, right? Unless they go back through that front door. So that's that whole testing of if you have something that can successfully do a mock exploit, there's various ways of doing it, including that autonomous tool or a red team test where you say, what's a common threat? What's an area of high risk for this organization? And then you do a mock incident. You want to test, was it detected? You also want to test, okay, let's say it was detected. Did your IT provider and or your staff take the appropriate actions? Had it been truly an incident? Did they know how to declare an incident? Do they know who they need to contact at the insurance company? Do they know if they have forensics available to them from their insurer? Do they have to report within a certain period of time to either their insurer or a regulatory body? All of these things that you don't want to think about, but you better think about them when it's not truly an incident.
Yeah.
Because again, I've sat in on a lot of red team exercises, and one that stood out to me, they had, I think it was a 14-person IT team, including a dedicated security team. And we were just walking through a mock incident and we said, okay, Joe, the CIO, he's at his ski house in New Hampshire and he doesn't have access to the phone. Now, what do you do? What's your next step?
Yeah.
And one little wrinkle like that, and the whole team fell apart. They really did not know what in the world they would do if that one person wasn't accessible to them. So just going through that kind of exercise can be very eye-opening. You want to have that documented. You want to have more than one person who knows where that document is and more than one person who knows how to get a hold of the insurer and what the policy number is and what's included in all of those things.
So do you think that that type of exercise, which is, I believe, a tabletop exercise, is conducive to do once a year or every time a new member comes in, a quarterly one? Because it does take some sort of time resource out of everybody that is part of the team. What do you suggest as the cadence for that kind of exercise?
Yeah, larger organizations tend to do it at least once a year, sometimes once a quarter, where they'll pick different types of incidents. Doesn't have to be a huge exercise, it can be something smaller, but for smaller organizations or small businesses, it doesn't even have to be all that involved. It can just be a simple walkthrough of, let's say, if you read in the paper that one of your competitors was hit with ransomware, think about what would we do if that happened and talk to your stakeholders about it. Talk to your IT person, whether they're internal or external. Make sure you do have that insurance information. Look at that policy. Would we be covered? How much would we be covered for? If it took you down for a week, what's your contingency plan? Do you have good backups that you could restore? Could you spin up services in the cloud somewhere so that you could keep running? There have been some very, very major companies that have been taken down for well over a week. And so it's not impossible, especially if the attacker can get in and get access to something like get access to your backups. We had someone who came to us recently, and the first thing the attacker did was erase all of their backups before they even let them know that they were in their environment. So when they demanded ransom and the client tried to go back to restore from their backups, they learned that there weren't any backups anymore. It was gone.
Wow. That's scary.
Right. So, just stepping through the what ifs, it can be in a more informal way, but don't wait for the incident because it's really hard for people to think clearly and take all the right actions. And that same situation where I was telling you where the attacker erased the backups first thing, they reached out to their IT support company, who is not any type of specialist in security. So the first thing they did was went and re-imaged the server. Well, the problem is when their insurance wanted to then bring in the forensics investigation, everything was wiped out. So again, was their data stolen or was it just erased? That's something that the lawyers will have to fight about. depending on what level of exposure this situation ends up getting and what kind of data it was. But not a good situation to be in if you're the business owner and you're ultimately responsible. You didn't take the right steps. They could try to go after the IT company and say you should have known you shouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
you don't see that being successful too often.
Yeah. Totally. Totally agree. Start blame somebody else instead of yourself.
Right. Yeah. There are some cases where MSPs have been held responsible if their literature says things like, don't worry about, your security, leave everything to us. We do everything for you. MSPs, managed service providers, have to be really careful to be very clear about what they do and do not do, because Joe business owner or executive director of a nonprofit or superintendent of a school, they don't have the distinction of Tracy's company, Foresight, specializes in cybersecurity, and my IT provider over here, they keep things running day to day, right? But that's
Yeah.
not their specialty. To them, it's all IT.
Right. Yeah. That's also another thing, perspective of what cybersecurity is versus the IT day-to-day break fix, computer servers, stuff like that. That people are, I guess, have a different perspective of how really they make it seem that it's all in one, but it's really separate, right?
And honestly, it needs to be separate too, that separation of duties. And that's why we partner with the managed service providers and the VARs, because you do want to have a separation of the people who recommend what firewall you use and implement these things for you and keep them up and running, whether you're paying someone outside to do it or you have an internal IT staff to do it. But it's nice to have that separation, then have the people testing and assessing that we're not the ones who installed it. Because if you think about it, if I installed something for you and I didn't know how to do it optimally, either for security or to make sure that it's meeting your compliance requirements, and now you're relying on me to oversee it, well, if I didn't know I did it wrong in the first place, I'm not going to know that later either, right?
Right.
The odds are, or if someone in my company detects that there was something wrong, especially if there was an incident, are they going to be honest and upfront and bring that to your attention and say, hey, we could have prevented this, but we didn't install this properly?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to take on that liability? So that separation really is a best practice, so that as the business owner, stakeholder, C-level executive or board, you know that an independent organization did the testing, and it's not to make anyone look bad. That's something where I know sometimes internal IT staff might have had a bad experience where they felt like someone was trying to make them look bad and potentially take their job and say, no, we'll take this over for you. You don't have to pay Joe anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy's firm can do it. That's not at all what we do. We're there to be that independent set of eyes to tell you either here are your risk areas and here's what's most critical and here's what to do to fix it. Or, hey, you're in great shape and Joe's doing a fantastic job, and stay the course. Don't get complacent. But either way, we want to make sure that Joe doesn't lose his job because you got attacked and Joe wasn't trained in security and he didn't know what it should have been there, and you didn't bring anyone in to help him figure that out.
Yeah. It's a helping hand. It's not trying to take your job. It's trying to help you.
Right. Security has been looked at as a hindrance to business in a lot of ways, but
Mm-hmm.
we want to make it, our tagline is we want to make it a catalyst for business. So
Yeah.
protect your business by protecting the data that you're entrusted with, and be proud, share with your customers and people that you want to partner with. We take security seriously. We've aligned with XYZ framework. Make that a selling point for working with you versus just doing the bare minimum and hoping nothing bad happens. Because if you do have an incident, that's one of the things that can be hard to quantify the cost of. Is you lose one major customer, could that put you under? And it does
Mm-hmm.
happen.
Yeah. My husband used to be a director of IT and cybersecurity. And he always had the dilemma of, yes, say yes to everything for the IT side. You guys can have everything, like you can have the new tools, you have this, blah, blah, blah. But then on the cybersecurity side, he's like, no, you can't. Right. Like, it's like,
Right.
This
Yeah,
is not is
we've got to lock it down.
yeah,
Yeah.
we gotta lock it
And
down, right? So
that's
he's
it.
like,
We want technology to help us do our jobs. And it's fantastic when you think back to before we had all the things we have, how spoiled we are of how quickly we can do things
mhm,
using Chat GPT, all the AI functionality. So one of the things that I least love to do is fill out RFPs. It's a
mhm,
necessary evil because we work with public sector, but we're training our AI agent to automate a lot of the busy work of it. And then, of course, we go through it and validate, but it saves us a ton of time. At the
yeah,
same time, you always have to have the guardrails of making sure that you have a very closed environment where you're feeding that information and that you are validating because you don't want any sensitive information to get exposed or get
yeah,
into the wrong hands.
yeah.
So it's always a balance of what's expedient to do the jobs that need to be done, but also how do we make sure that we're protecting the data that we have?
Yeah. Well, speaking of AI, so looking ahead, how do you see the rapid integration of AI and machine learning fundamentally altering the landscape of cyber risk for the decision makers you advise? What's the non-obvious defensive strategy?
Well, I think it can be a huge help. The managed autonomous testing is really leveraging a lot of that technology. So training it to be like an attacker, but it's working for us instead of against us.
Mm,
So I think that's been fantastic. I was just last week at a Google public sector event in DC, and I was listening as they had clients on different panels talk about things like New York Department of Transportation. They trained Google AI when they have those cameras on the highways. It can capture the traffic coming down a highway. So
mhm,
now it's doing immediate measurements when it sees something like a box truck or a large 18-wheeler. It does immediate calculations of how high that truck is. And if it knows on that route there's an overpass that could be an issue, it can dispatch law enforcement to intercept the vehicle before it hits the overpass.
wow.
So, you hear about some of those things and you think that's amazing. And then on another panel, Katie Arrington, who's the CIO for the Department of War, was talking about how she's using AI in a very closed AI environment to run scenarios so they can prepare for different types of attacks, but that it is a challenge, especially when you consider the kind of information that her department
Mhm,
has access to,
yeah.
that you really always have to be focused on the security. So I think, it's that same mix of it's a fantastic tool, but make sure that it's done in a secure way.
Mhm, yeah.
Even things like testing chatbots. We now have pen testing for AI chatbots. You
Oh,
want to make sure, is it going to expose data? Where
mhm.
is this data going? What's it doing with it?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about that.
Mhm.
You learn something new every day. So, beyond basic defense, what must the modern executive mandate be regarding resilience? Is it survival or is it building security into core drivers of digital transformation?
I think it's just got to be that it's part of the fiber of the business, that it's
Mm,
a culture within the business from the top all the way down. It just can't be siloed. It can't be an afterthought or a necessary evil. It just has to be a core part of the business. So, how are you going to drive your business forward if you can't survive? And how are you going to survive if you can't secure your environment in a way that you're not going to have an incident so major that it can take you down?
yeah.
Make it so that your business or your organization can't survive. So I just think it's got to be part of that whole culture because if the C level doesn't take it seriously, if
Why
only
would
IT takes it seriously, right, it's really hard to make it effective.
yeah, I totally agree because based on my experience, starting in IT, yeah, we were more nonchalant about it. Towards the end, when I went to school and did my master's in cybersecurity.
Mm.
So during that experience, when I was working there, I started to be more involved with the cybersecurity aspects of the IT department. And I was like, we need to be more secure. Like, why are we not talking about cybersecurity awareness training? Passwords. Like, I've seen passwords everywhere. I know everybody's passwords at that point. Like, I'm like, I should know this, right?
Right.
So I was like, okay, well, I need to figure out a way to teach cybersecurity awareness training. Like, I need to do like a lunch and learn or something like that. I was like, I need to be more involved. But like, I don't know if the C-suite was like, yeah, that's a good idea for you to do this because we are vulnerable. But I
Mhm.
don't, I don't think there was that aspect that was like, it's important.
It's definitely gotten more attention. That's one good thing about when things come out in the news, then you'll start hearing from, let's say, healthcare. Healthcare had a chain of attacks. What was it, a couple of years ago, I think, where 13 or 14 different healthcare organizations got hit within a month span.
Hmm.
So there's those very targeted kind of attacks, and then it gets all the other healthcare organizations seeing their peers getting attacked, saying, oh, where do we stand? How do we make sure we're not next? You don't want it to get to that point, but sometimes that's what it takes, is
Yeah.
that awareness. Because, one of the things that we used to hear a lot is nobody's concerned, why do I have to do this? I'm a manufacturer of XYZ based in Western Massachusetts. What attacker is going to come after me? Well, you know what? You really don't know, because is there one thing that you make for Department of Defense, and maybe they think that you're a vector into getting to some data or some
Right.
information that they want, or you're a law firm, but you might have a client that's a target. And if they figure out who the law firm is, maybe they can get to some really sensitive information, because as a law firm, you don't have maybe the same level of compliance requirement as this credit union or this, whatever it is, right? A biomedical company that has a really proprietary solution, and they're trying to get information on it. It's crazy the things that they will research and figure out and then try to get through.
Yeah.
Maybe they know you're a manufacturer and they want access to your proprietary plans
Hmm.
or recipe, whatever it is, and they figure out that you use outside developers who have access into your network. Could
Right.
they get to those developers, or how secure is that connection? So there's a lot of crazy things. I think one of the strangest ones was back, it was some government agency, and they figured out how to put spyware into the menu, the online Chinese menu that for the
Oh,
restaurant they would order from for lunch, you know. So the things you would never think of, they will think of. So don't assume that you're not a target, whether it's your organization directly or maybe you've got some tie to somebody that is a target.
right. Third party. The third party aspects of things, like how Target got hacked because of a third party, right? I think it was
Right.
a HVAC system employee that had access to something, and then something happened. I don't remember the story, but I remember that it was like the third party HVAC system employee that had access.
Mhm.
So you don't think that they would do something like to the HVAC company, but it happens,
Right.
right?
So that goes back to, if you take your client's security seriously, which you should, if you have any kind of access or data that belongs to your customers or your patients or your constituents, whatever your organization does, you have access to things that belong to someone else. That's how you do business or run a nonprofit or provide healthcare or whatever it is that your mission is. So you need to take that really seriously, not only for your own benefit, but you don't want to be that third party risk that caused an incident for someone else either. Not only for the financial impacts to you, the liability, but also if you really care about your mission, then you don't
Yeah,
want to expose your clients, your patients, your constituents, your members to
data.
that kind of data exposure and the impact on them,
Yeah. And also it's your reputation, right? So the
right?
reputation of your company is like, you did get attacked, and then now let's say that I'm a constituent or a member of said company that got attacked. Well, now I don't have trust in your company because you did get hacked and you did not, I would believe at that point, you did not do your due diligence on being secure, like what was your measure? What happened? So that those are the things that I, as a member of said company, I would be like, I don't know about this, like no
Right.
longer be a member. Like you would lose your clients, you would lose reputation, you lose money overall, lose more money than you would invest in cybersecurity, right? Like to be secure. At the end of the day, the price tag is always bigger than the initial investment in securing your data.
Right. And we see it all the time is when you want to do business with a company. So we were recently looking for a new tool for our partner portal. We wanted to get a new solution. And we
Mhm.
looked at a lot of different companies, but we immediately ruled out any company that could not proactively provide us with proof of how they're handling their security.
That makes sense.
So, did they have a SOC 2? And if they did, don't just take a SOC 2 certification. You want to make sure you know what was the scope of it, how
Mhm.
was it applied, because one thing about a SOC 2 is that the organization can dictate what the scope is. So if my data's over here and your SOC 2's on the systems over there, that doesn't help me. But you want to make sure they're proactively showing that they do take data security very seriously, and here's what they do. And it was amazing that there were still a few companies who really couldn't provide us anything, and we're shocked that we said we don't even need to see the demo because there's no way. We're a security company.
Right.
There's no way we're working with a company that's not diligent about security. But I
Right.
think even companies who are not security companies are taking that more seriously and thinking about those things and asking to see that kind of proof.
And
So we definitely have seen people come to us after they were either trying to win a large contract or work with the government, whatever it is. And then they figure out, oh, I'm being asked these questions I can't answer. Sometimes that's when we'll get a client to say, hey, we need help aligning. The problem is we can help you align. We can get you there. It doesn't take a week. In
right.
most cases, you're looking at months, maybe a year or more, depending on how far off you are today from where you need to be and how quickly you can apply the resources, be it money, people, redoing the network, depending on what it's going to take to get you there. So if you wait till the last minute, then your biggest client says, well, we assumed that you were doing these things and now you're not. We're going to go to your competitor. We can't turn that around on a dime for you. Nobody really can. So you really need to think about it ahead of time
Yeah.
and make the business case for yourself. If you've got one client that's half your business, 3/4 of your business, that's a huge risk. Maybe if you're not in that scenario, then maybe, you can be a little more lenient and look at where your highest risk is and focus more on that. So some of it is a business decision. I wouldn't advise somebody to do enterprise level security if they're a small business and they don't have health data, financial data,
Right.
limited amount of data from outside, limited amount of anything that would be critical to them to protect, then that's a different level of investment.
Yeah, totally agree. Because a business that's like, a 5-person shop that is doing, let's just say, selling, what's it called? Personalized items, let's say candles, does not have the same security needs as an enterprise company. Because at that point, as that small business candle seller has credit card information. Yes. And I think that would probably be it, right? Like, and maybe
Well,
their own
so it
data.
depends because, right. So if they have something proprietary, so they have to go all the way back. If they're running credit cards, ideally, they want to be using a service where none of that credit card information ever comes into their network
Right.
because they don't want the burden of all the PCI requirements. So they can outsource that. So
Mhm.
that's one aspect. Another aspect would be don't assume that because you don't have health or credit card data, all states have some level of data privacy law. And so if you're collecting my name, my address, my phone number, my email, even if some of that or all of that was publicly available, if you're collecting it, there's an expectation that you're also protecting it. And the Federal
Okay.
Trade Commission has the right to enforce that. And we've seen them do it even on small businesses of 100 people, 140 people, where it was six-figure fines. There was no breach. But if the FTC sees on a website, for example, a little statement about protecting data, they can reach out and say, show us
What
how
are you
you're
doing?
protecting this data. Now, they were more proactive with that pre-COVID. We probably had 6 to 12 of those where people came to us after the FTC had proactively contacted them and they couldn't show the reasonable level of data protection, even if they were doing some things right. The smallest fine was $100,000. And this
Whoa.
was without any data exposure. And so then you also have to think, well, will your commercial cyber insurance cover something if there wasn't a breach? And some coverages will exclude regulatory fines because they're meant to be punitive. So it's just all those little nuances. So don't assume that just because you don't have health data or credit card data or financial data of some kind. And then that third piece I think you touched on lightly was, what if you have something? So there was a gourmet popcorn company that got breached and their secret recipe got stolen. So, what is the value of that? Now someone can duplicate their recipe. So if you have something proprietary or even your customer list, what if a competitor got your customer list? What could that do to your business? So those are all the kinds of things. Think about all the types of data you have and what would the impact be if that data got exposed? Because the biggest issue is attackers for a while when they were doing ransomware, they would just lock up your data. If you could restore from a backup, or worst case, if you did pay them and get your data back, okay, that was bad enough. But if the data gets stolen and put out for sale on the dark web, whether you paid or not, they could still put that data out on the dark web. You don't know that they're not going to. Once the data's out there, it's out there. And then there's nothing I can do or you can do or anybody can do to unring the bell.
Right.
So whatever those ramifications are, whether it's the embarrassment, reputational damage, or something got exposed that could be hurtful to your organization or to your clients or patients, it's done, unfortunately.
All right. That's an eye opener. Let's get a little bit personal here. So, what is the driving mission behind your work at Foresight? What is the one impact you feel is a non-negotiable for your team to achieve for your C-suite clients?
We're really looking to empower them to protect what they're entrusted with. So again, going back to that, we want to be the catalyst to advance their mission by helping them to be secure.
Okay. What is the single most valuable piece of executive leadership advice you've received that you now apply to consulting on risk and security strategy?
Don't assume anything.
Yeah,
Question, listen, ask questions, test, validate. Just don't assume anything.
trust but verify.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. All right. So, Tracy, I thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about all this wonderful world of cybersecurity and a touch bit of AI. So, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to the audience for joining us on this episode. Thank you,
Yes,
guys.
thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.